got our first question. My favorite class was trial advocacy. I really like CTA. At Northwestern, I don't know if you guys do it the same way, but they combined ethics, trial advocacy, and evidence all together. It was fabulous. So basically, like, it was just fabulous. It was basically, you had a trial that you would actually put on at the end of the semester. And then within that, you would also have evidence. So you would take, but it was all from the same area, the same purview. So you had the trial practice coupled with evidence, and then also ethics. It was fabulous. It was absolutely my favorite class. And I would be excited about going to school every single day because it was phenomenal. Other questions? But I want to say something very clear. I hated law school, but I just really liked that class, but I really hated law school. Okay, because it was brutal, but other questions? Not with the LSAT. The LSAT is I'm just going to say it as a completely evil exam. I think that the LSAT has single-handedly destroyed countless numbers of lives. And I think the LSAT does nothing to measure what kind of a student you're going to be. And it does nothing to measure what kind of attorney a person's going to be. Here's an example. A, B, C, D, E, and F go into a restaurant. If A is next to C and B is next to D and E is next to F, where is A in relation to C? It actually tells you that you're required to draw a diagram in order to solve the problem. So how does a blind person do that? And it actually gives you space provided in order to do that. But how does a blind person do that? It's simply not possible. But yet, blind people were required to take it. And then law schools would say, oh, wow, we'd love to have you, but if we take you, it's going to screw up our rankings. And therefore, we're going to kind of take a pass on it. The worst exam ever, and how that was allowed to pervade our process and our system defies explanation or any understanding of how that could be the case. Defies it. But so we sued the American Bar Association. The reason we sued the American Bar Association was because ultimately the American Bar Association has been delegated by the Department of Education the power and the authority to accredit law schools. So the ABA basically is using the LSAT as an accreditation measure. So if a law school shies away from the LSAT, they get a little concerned because it could put their accreditation at risk. So that case was a pretty intense case that went on for a while. But we ultimately sued the Law School Admissions Council in addition to that. And I'm proud to say, I teamed up with one of my best buddies, who's one of the best lawyers you're going to come across, Jason Turkish, remarkable attorney. And, they are going to be restructuring the entire logical game section because the logical game section is completely illegal and is completely inappropriate for people that have any kind of visual impairment because they can't do it. Same thing with a learning disability, same thing with attention deficit, whatever you got, the logical game section is going to make it really unattainable in order for someone to perform at the level that they're meant to perform. So that was incredibly unfortunate. In fact, the American Bar Association adopted Section 503 that basically said, if you violate the terms and conditions of LSAT accreditation, we'll put that at risk. But now I think the LSAT's really been taken down a notch. And I think with all the different things, people realize its flaws and people realize that it's really garbage. And so at the end of the day, I think what's really happened is schools are pulling away from it. There's no longer any kind of, you're not going to have any problem if you pull away from it now because they've been scrutinized so much. They're going to have to redo the entire test. There's not going to be a logical game section the way it was. So the exam is kind of pointless. Now, I think law schools are going to probably rely more on the GRE or they're going to rely on other types of methodology. But I think the LSAT is literally, it's like the day of the past. I think but the LSAT, I don't want to go on about it, but it was horrible. Law School Admissions Council, they had a stranglehold, just a stranglehold over law schools. It was just disgraceful. The stranglehold that they had over various law schools was incredible what they ultimately did to various schools and the behavior that they and how they treated people and their counsel actually went and taught a class. Joan Van Tol, she went and taught a class on how to deny people accommodations. I mean, that's how nasty this was. That's what a battle this was, just to get into school and just to find your way to have a chance to get an education. That's how tough it was. But ultimately, things are changing. But no, they were not fair. And the American Bar Association, I think, really dropped the ball on this one. And I think basically the one good thing the American Bar Association, I find, is good at is car rentals and hotels. But other than that, I don't, I'm not a huge fan of that organization, mainly because of how they handled the situation. But in the end, it kind of got rectified. Other questions? I just didn't think there was a choice. Like, this was my project. I had to get through it. I had to do it. It was brutal. Oh, it was just brutal. Every day was brutal. And I just, a lot of you are going through the same thing, right? You wake up and you're like, oh my God, especially when you're the bottom, like myself, right? Like the people that were at the top of the class, well, they were doing great. They were the top. They felt good. They could act good. They were doing good. But the people like me who were kind of towards the bottom, it wasn't much fun to wake up in the morning, go to school and trudge through the ice and snow and do all that. It was miserable, but, and then get through the bar and all that kind of stuff. But I think it was just that sense of, I didn't really have a choice. I really wanted to do this. And, I really wanted to become a lawyer. And this was just something I was going to really fight for and aspire towards. Other questions? I mean, look, that's a tall order. It's a day by day process because at the end of the day, look, the easiest thing for a large firm to do when they're coming, look, when they send someone to do the interviews on campus, I remember at my school, there was a rule. They had to interview with anybody that wanted to interview with them. So if Sidley came or Kirkland came or Mayer came or whoever, wanted to come to Northwestern, the rule was that if they came, they had a requirement that any law school applicant had to meet with them. So they couldn't pre-select. They couldn't come and say, Sidley and Austin couldn't come and say, we're going to only interview these people. And the law school wouldn't furnish them grades or transcripts. I mean, but the whole thing was just kind of a show because the minute you got there, they would ask you for your grades and your transcripts. So, it was what it was, right? And as soon as they saw my grades, those interviews weren't going anywhere. But at least I got to interview them, right? At least I got to sit down with them. But usually the people they would send, very nice people, but they'd usually be like lower level associates. And, their job was really to come to the school, collect resumes, take them back to the firm. And then they would do probably what they do everywhere else, where they would take the top 5%, 10% of the class. And that was probably, my sense of how it worked, because I went for like 65 interviews. I just interviewed with all I wanted was a callback. So I literally went for 65 interviews. Excuse me. And out of the 65 interviews, I didn't get a single callback, not a single one. And that was just the way it was. But you kind of got used to it when you're disabled. You just get used to it. But you also have to understand the principle and how they're operating, right? If I'm a big law firm, the challenge for them is, look, I got to do billables by the hour. So a typical firm is going to probably want 2,000 billable hours a year. Well, if it takes me 5 times to do that, well, I'm not going to do 10,000, right? So it's going to take me forever. So the challenge is it's not that like they don't want to, it's just hard because when they come and interview, they're going to look and they're going to say, oh, this person is blind. He seems like a great guy, but I've got 50 other people behind this person. So why would I just not go on and work with the 50 other people that I can choose from? Why am I going to have to make my firm accessible? Why am I have to do all this? It's a big job. Why do I have to do all this? So that's the thing that you got to kind of overcome. And, I think, you got to carve out, if you have a disability, you got to carve out a niche for yourself. You got to carve out like a way to do something that's unique or different, but you've got to carve out something that is basically going to allow for you to find your way. So where do a lot of disabled people go? They go to the government. The government usually tends to be open to people with special needs or disabilities because the government has unlimited resources. They can provide the technology, they can provide readers, they can provide all the things that they need to provide. The government can do all that. So a lot of it is you just have to figure out kind of how to carve a niche for yourself and figure out what the best pathway for that niche is going to be. So if you're disabled, you can't just go, well, you can, but if you just go the traditional way, that's not always going to be the easiest. If you can carve out a different way or a different option, then, that could give you some newer opportunities. Other questions? That's a great question. There haven't been too many. I think that ultimately, the biggest challenge that we faced, the biggest setback that came was COVID. And all of the working from home and it was a disaster for people that are blind, especially people like myself. And I think that the pandemic, has set back disability quite a bit. And the reason I think that is because people, I think that, and this is just me, I'm just putting my own little hat on here and I'm just going to say my own thing. Now, I want to just very carefully say, I understand and respect and appreciate how serious COVID was. I want to be very clear about that, right? I lost some good friends to COVID who died. There's people I'm sure here today who have relatives that they lost as a result of COVID. So there's no way. I want to emphasize how serious it was, how traumatic it was, how significant it was. I don't want to undermine that ever undermine how serious it was. However, the restrictions that were put upon in certain states were devastating to people with disabilities. They were devastating to people like myself who are blind. Devastating isn't the word for it. My fiance lived in New York. I was in Detroit. We couldn't get back and forth. But most importantly, I spent months alone. And what people don't realize is that Zoom is not accessible. So I couldn't even do anything unless you would do it by phone. And most people wouldn't want to do it by phone. I was basically left out of everything. Wasn't able to participate in anything. It was a disaster. And unfortunately, if you were to look now at the statistics and what's happened, the suicide rate amongst the disabled as a result of COVID is astronomical. Astronomical. People took their lives. And you can understand why. And you can't fault them because of the isolation, because most people live alone. And that isolation was so pronounced and so horrific that people just didn't know what to do. Hearing impaired people weren't able to even go out and communicate because they couldn't read lips because of the masks. So it just, what I learned from that is that government has to be cautious when government acts. I understand there's emergencies. I understand there's all these types of things that happen. But what happens is when you give away your rights so quickly and so fast, and you let everybody make decisions quickly and without, thinking about consequences, like shutting down Uber for people with disabilities meant we couldn't get food. I couldn't get food. So you have to I would just say, when you ask that question, I would just simply say that one of the things that we all have to learn is we have to learn that government, when people act quickly and when people don't take into account all the ramifications, and sometimes government just isn't able to do it, that's what you have to be most mindful of, right? That's what you have to be most mindful of. You have to be mindful when a new law comes down. You have to be mindful when people are scared. You have to be mindful when there's a time of panic. Because when there's a time of panic, that's when people's rights get taken. And when people's rights are taken, That's when you have situations that develop that can be incredibly problematic and can be incredibly dangerous and can ultimately have profound unintended consequences. So I would say to you that there hasn't been a lot of movement in disability law because candidly, I think you're going to see this isn't going to be a big thing for a while. And you know why that is? Because I think people's empathy has been taxed. I think it used to be that, look, people always understood, people cared. This was important to people. But I think what happened after COVID was people were like, you know what, enough. I lost my job, I lost my family, I lost my way of life. You when you push people to a limit, whether it's right or wrong, when people get affected to such a degree, their empathy or their willingness is tested to a point where they're going to say, you know what, I've already made my sacrifice. I've already done what I've had to do. I'm not going to, I'm just simply not going to do it. So I don't think at this point, you always have to read the tea leaves. You have to read where the public is. And unfortunately, I think in this area, as much as I wish it wasn't the case, I think we have to work with what we've got. I think we have to be excited about what we've got. I think we have to be proud of what we've got. But I think we have to also recognize that you're not going to have huge leaps for quite some time because there's just too much going on in the world. There's too much happening. And I think people are exhausted, and you have to know your time and you have to know people. And if people are tired and people are exhausted and people just are not in that empathetic mood, then I think that's going to create heightened challenges that are going to make it more difficult. Other questions? Oh, okay, one more question. Be good at what you do. I mean, just by hearing you speak, you sound like you're a pretty impressive guy. So you know what? Just be good at what you do. Be good at what you do. If you're good at what you do, if you present well, that's what people want to see. I always tell people when I travel across the world, and most countries don't allow for judges to have disabilities. They're not allowed to serve as judges if they're disabled. But the key is, you know how you do it? Just be good at what you do. Show people that you can do it. Show people how you function. Show people what it is that you do. And if you're good at what you do, you can showcase that. I think a person like yourself isn't going to have any problem. And thank you all so much. And thank you for coming.